welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to share this with you today because, honestly, we're going to completely reframe how we look at history. Now, when you think of the 16th century Portuguese Empire, you probably picture wooden ships, the spice trade, and colonial conquests, right? But what if I told you that this vast maritime empire was actually the world's very first global data network? Seriously. Long before the internet was even a spark of an idea, the Portuguese were building this massive, planet-wide machine specifically for gathering, processing, and literally uploading information.
Okay, let's dive into this. Who really mapped the natural world? You know, we're so often taught that the scientific revolution was built solely by these lone European geniuses, guys looking through telescopes or mixing chemicals in isolated labs. But the reality? It's far more collaborative, far messier, and infinitely more fascinating. Modern science didn't just magically spring out of Europe. It was a massive co-creation that happened across the entire globe.
Section 1. The Science of Sea Empires.
Let's start by looking at the hardware of this network. The sheer staggering magnitude of the Portuguese Maritime Empire forced an absolute transformation in how human beings understood the world. I mean, from the coast of Brazil to the Indian Ocean and all the way to the seas of China and Japan, they were operating on a scale that was completely unprecedented. To understand why they desperately needed a data network, we have to look at the economics. Europe was shifting away from medieval self-sufficient manners into an era of aggressive mercantilism. And mercantilism? Well, that was all about building a wealthy, powerful state by securing a favorable balance of trade. But here's the kicker. You can't run a global trade monopoly relying on guesswork. This entire system demanded state-regulated, highly advanced navigational and astronomical science just to secure those incredibly lucrative trade routes.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about. Expanding a sea empire required absolutely rigorous astronomical observations, like this early Iberian astronomical chart tracking a comet. You simply couldn't guess your way across the open ocean. The Portuguese actually established state-supported institutions to train nautical personnel, to certify instruments like the marine quadrant and the astrolabe, and to map the stars. It was a massive institutionalization of science, and it was entirely driven by the practical need to navigate the globe safely.
Section 2. Enter the Jesuit network.
So, you have this massive empire and a desperate, urgent need for data. But who is actually gathering this information on the ground? Enter the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits effectively became these highly trained human nodes deployed across the globe to gather, translate, and transmit data right back to the European server. And just look at how rapidly this network was deployed. They arrive in Portugal in 1540, and by 1574 they founded the Aula da Esfera, the course on the sphere in Lisbon. And this wasn't just some standard religious or philosophical school, it was designed specifically by royal demand to provide hardcore technical and mathematical training to the personnel running the Maritime Empire. Pretty soon they were setting up observatories and beaming data back from places like Brazil and Asia.
So what exactly were these Jesuit nodes executing out there on the remote edges of the empire? Basically, a highly systematic program of data collection. You had guys like Valentin Stancil tracking comets in Bahia, Brazil. Others were performing intricate cartographic boundary mapping to physically secure territory. Jesuits like João de Loureiro meticulously cataloged entirely new ecosystems in works like the Flora Cochinchiniensis. But most importantly, and this is a huge takeaway, they acted as scientific intermediaries. They were actively translating indigenous botanical knowledge and circulating it back to Europe through these massive, complex networks of missionary correspondence.
Section 3. Columbian Exchange and Survival.
Now, here is where the network really hit its breaking point. As European colonizers and their science expanded, they crashed headfirst into entirely new tropical environments, unleashing an absolute epidemiological disaster known as the Columbian Exchange. And we really have to pause here to reflect on the devastating human cost of this era. As this quote from the Mayan book of Chilambalam starkly records, "There was then no sickness. The foreigners made it otherwise when they arrived here." This exchange brought smallpox and utter devastation to indigenous populations, while at the exact same time, Europeans found themselves dying in droves from tropical diseases that their own medicine just could not cure.
And that brings us to a rather grand, deeply ironic historical contradiction. You see, European literature and colonizers frequently and arrogantly dismissed indigenous cultures and institutions as archaic or inferior. Yet, when they were actually on the ground, literally dying in the dense forests of Brazil or the shores of India, those exact same Europeans were desperately relying on indigenous medical knowledge just to survive the week. Their own European medicines simply did not work in the tropics.
Section 4.
Plural healing in practice.
So how did they survive? Well, they adopted a fascinating, messy, and highly effective medical workaround called plural healing. Because there was such a severe lack of formally trained European physicians and surgeons in the colonies, medical practice on the ground became this incredibly pragmatic fusion. It blended European theories directly with indigenous botanical knowledge, as well as African healing practices and concepts of disease. It was all hands on deck.
Because the truth is, the real colonial healers weren't university-trained doctors sitting back in Lisbon. No way. They were indigenous midwives and botanical experts, alongside African healers. And, once again, our Jesuit priests. The Jesuits stepped in as crucial medical intermediaries. They were sitting side by side with indigenous practitioners, learning their botanical secrets and actively using that integrated knowledge to keep the empire's personnel alive. The very survival of the Portuguese Empire relied heavily on non-European healers and the Jesuits who engaged with them.
Section 5. Uploading indigenous knowledge. Which brings us to the final, absolutely critical step of this global network. How did the raw data, this plural, healing, and vast local botanical knowledge, actually get systematically packaged and uploaded into the European scientific record? Well, a prime example is Garcia de Orta's 1563 work, Colloquies on the Simples and Drugs of India. He completely systematized the knowledge and medical applications of newly encountered Asian plants for a European audience. But what's crucial to understand here is that he didn't invent this knowledge out of thin air. He observed and documented local indigenous cures. This text was later translated into Latin, which basically unlocked this indigenous science and made it accessible to the entire European academic world.
So, the crucial point is that this wasn't a one-way street. It was a multi-directional flow of critical scientific data. Europeans learned advanced ecosystem management from South India and China. They integrated local botanical remedies from Brazil straight into the official Portuguese pharmacopoeia. And incredibly, they sourced quinine from the Americas. This was the very first effective treatment for malaria, and it literally enabled further European global exploration. It was a total game changer.
Historians actually refer to this process as the domestication of science. It's the exact pipeline of how a state absorbs external intellectual property. Think of it like this. Step 1. The medicinal property is discovered and refined over centuries by indigenous populations. Step 2. It gets collected, observed, and documented by colonial nodes, very often our Jesuit priests. And then, step 3, it is shipped back to Europe, classified, renamed, and fully integrated as accredited Portuguese or European medicine.
Which amazingly brings us right back to the stars, and Tycho Brahe's famous observation of the 1572 supernova. We normally associate this purely with the Northern European scientific revolution, but as we've seen today, this revolution was happening concurrently with the massive, globe-spanning data collection machine of the Iberian empires. The knowledge to navigate the oceans, the medicines to survive new continents, and the mathematics to map the cosmos were all fundamentally intertwined in a massive global co-creation.
And that leaves us with a really profound question to end this explainer. If modern science was built not just in European universities, but literally on the backs of indigenous knowledge, African healing practices, and a vast global network of data gatherers, who truly owns the history of discovery? I really hope this makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about the scientific revolution. Thank you so much for exploring this with me.